Morning.
Good morning. Okay, good morning. We're in Ayin Beis, volume 2, page 1150. 1150, around 2/3 of the way down. So we've been learning now is the third interpretation, the third approach to the two levels of ayin, that they're referring to the two dimensions of the kav. The kav remember is the operative Mamalakal Alman. The Frierdiker Rebbe said the kav in general and Mamalakal Alman more specifically, but the kav is the mamala essentially that shapes, defines, and creates all of existence. Obviously with the power of divine energy. And we explained that the kav has two sides to it. There's the top of the kav, so to speak, the high point, the highest level of the kav, which is its connection, its attachment to the Ein Sof that's before the Tzimtzum. And it touches attached to it. And that's the ayin of the Yesh Amiti. And there's the kav, what he calls the Tachten Shebekav, the lower dimensions of the kav, or the lower dimension, which relates to existence. So that upper level of the kav, in a way, is removed from existence, even though the kav is going to create and shape, but its focus on that level is the divine, let's call it delegation, I would say the delegation, the power of authority, the divine presence, instructing the kav, essentially to achieve what it has to achieve. So the focus is a lot more on the divine energy than on the objective that it will ultimately shape and create. So the first level of the kav is the ayin of the yesh hamiti. The second level of the kav is the ayin of the yesh hamisava, of the created and the misava. And that's why, and that begins with the bringing into being of the kelim, which begin in akudim. In Ak, Adam Kadman there's no kelim yet. It's only called Sherish Neshamas de Gufis. It's the root of the Neshamas of the bodies, as we discussed at length yesterday. Why? Because an Ak is still radiating the Kav as it is in its original earliest stages, in its highest level. So there's no real room for Metzias Dava, for kelim, or for anything of substance. And that's why Ak, as he explained in the parentheses, on one hand, contains the image. Like he says, Sheifa Mabidat Seif Kaladeris, that it gazes and sees. All the generations, every detailed generation, but it's all in one image. It's in one snapshot. And as such, it's not really a mitzias. You can't call it a breakdown of details. It's in one snapshot, you see all of time, all of space. Yeah, because it's not a Metzias klal. It's only in Akudim, where the Kav is already becoming more distancing itself from its source. So it's not in the basking under the influence of the source. That's when somewhat moved from Mekede. There you have the beginnings of the shaping of the Havoyas Akeli, of the bringing into being of the container. And we also explained, he added the Gamzeh, Aide B'chinas Moti V'leit Moti. So it's not just that it distances itself, it's the process is a Moti V'lei Moti. As we explained, it's a movement and a return, a constant back and forth, which is what allows the flow to be able to extend itself, but it continuously reconnects to its source. So it's a constant back and forth. Moti v'loy moti. That's only richacher, because when you're in the source, there's no moti v'loy moti. There's no two movements. Everything is closeness. You're all close. Moti v'loy moti is the beginning of a movement away from one higher level to a lower level. Okay, that's where we stopped. This is where we'll continue now. Omnom be'emes However, in truth, Sarach Leimer, the Omnam seems to be maybe before he said that Yesh Leimer b'pshitus, that all that we said right now is the simple, what he calls b'pshitus, a simple, not simple, but in an obvious way, how you can explain the two levels of ayin in mamala kalam, the kav. It could be the omnam is now qualifying that. We'll see in a minute what the omnam is. Omnam be'emes sarich leimer. However, in truth, you have to say the commotion is boily ill, just like we explained earlier. Be'erein sof shalifnei tzimtzum. We discussed earlier in the levels in Erein sof, in the infinite divine energy pre-tzimtzum. Hainu ba'er habligvul. Because that's Er HaBligvul. Even though there's the beginnings of God envisioning Er HaGvul, but everything there is Er HaBligvul, because it's all encompassed in the Er Ein Sof Lifnei Tzimtzum. So he says, just like we explained earlier in that about that Er Lifnei Tzimtzum, which is Er HaBligvul, sheyesh b'zeh b'chinas etzem b'spashtus. So remember, the top of the previous page, 1149, he said there's two levels in the Er. Etzem and Ispashtus, actually page 1148 he begins, but continues on 1149, that we learned there's two levels of Eir. One is Etzem Eir, which all it is just an extension outside of Atzmus, but it doesn't have any further extension. There's no Hamshach and no Gili. And then Ispashtus Eir is already the expressive element, the functionality, if you wish, of Eir. So he says, just like we learned about Lifnei Tzimtzum in the Er HaBligvul, that there's two levels, the B'chinas Etzem Ha'er is going to explain that the core of energy, the core, the essence of the Er, Hu Shekamoya Etzem, that just like the Etzem itself, She'ena B'chinas Ispashtus V'Hamshacha B'Etzem, that the Etzem Ha'er is just like the Etzem itself, because it reflects the Etzem. And what is the Etzem? That's in a state of you can't call it even extended. The only thing you could say, it's not atzmus, but you can't say it's anything but. So there's no ispashtus and hamshacha be'etzem. There's no ispashtus, there's no extension, no hamshacha, no. Ispashtus would be extension or expression. Hamshacha means, ispashtus is more of a extending outward, and hamshacha is more expression or being some form of transmission. There's no extension and no transmission. That would be the best way to translate it. Canal. I'm sorry, not canal. That's one level. Level two, Lifnei Tzimtzum. And then there's the second level in the energy, which is already in a state of extension, meaning it's beginning to function out, not just being a pure reflection of Atzmus. And in that level, as Pashta said, we learned, there it's possible that it should get diminished in this flow. Now remember, until the Tzimtzum, there's no diminishments. But now the air is already subject to the concept of being leveled and diminished. This is the other Eisvir. This is the Rebbe Rashab saying, just as we learned before about Er HaBligvul, Lifnei Tzimtzum, that there's these two levels, Kamoy Kain, who Gampkin by Er Pnimi B'chlal. Same thing is also in the immanent energy. Remember, we said there's two levels of ayin there in Er Pnimi, which is the third interpretation. In the first interpretation, was Etzem Er Nishpashtus Er. So the Rebbe Rashab is saying that in truth, just like you had those two levels before the Tzimtzum, in the infinite energy, same thing is in the immanent energy. In general, you also have two things. The B'chlolos Ha'er, Yesh Beis Madreges, that the general Er Pnimi, in the general immanent energy, has two levels. Also similar, what are the two levels? V'hu b'chinas etzem ha'er, the etzem of the er mamala. In other words, everything has an etzem in his pashtus. We've talked about this a number of times. Whatever level it's at, there's an etzem in his pashtus. Even the sun, which is not a real etzem, the sun is a created yesh. But still, the sun compared to sunlight is like etzem hashemesh and ispashtus ha'er hashemesh. Same thing with the nefesh. You have etzem nefesh and er hanefesh, ispashtus. In other words, everything has a core, essential state, and then how that state begins to express itself. So just as we have etzem ispashtus before the tzimtzum and er ablikvul, he says the same thing is in mamala kalam, not the same level, but the same two dimensions. That there's two dimensions. The etzem ha'eshu b'chinas dveikus mamish ba'atzmus ein sof. Er mamala, remember, is also divine energy. It's a divine energy that is intended to be immanent, internal, not like er bligvul and er makiv that remains removed. So there's also two levels. The first is its dveikus mamish ba'atzmus ein sof. The er mamala is completely attached and fulfilling and completely connected to its source, Atzmus Ein Sof. And not just the dveikus, that's like the tzimtzum k'moy hakav b'chlal shenegeya v'dovuk be'eran semp sof avul hu ha'idei tzimtzum. So now, yes, the omnam be'emes is referring to what he said in the beginning. In the beginning, he said the most obvious way to explain the two levels of ayin in mamala is the two levels of the kav. The Rebbe Rashab is, however, not sufficing with that. He says, in truth, mamala, there's two levels that even before the kav. And that's what he's saying. So now we're saying that there's two levels. One level is that it's attached to its source. Remember, God is instructing Eira Mamala to be an energy that's going to manifest within. It's like saying Shem Havaya and Shem Elikim. Shem Elikim is not less of a divine name than Shem Havaya. It's just that Shem Havaya is a reflection of the God's bligvul, rachamim. And Shem Elikim is hein gvuresov, it's God's reflection, it's God's expression, bedin and simsum and concealment. But Havaya hu Elikim. It's not like one is more godly than the other. They're both names of God. They just have different functions. So the same thing, I just gave that example based on Shaykhid Vamun and other places. Even here we learned about this earlier, but the point making here is there's a part of Mamala Kalalman that yes, it's an immanent energy, it's meant to enter and create and shape existence, not like Seviv Kalalman, and not like Etzem or Er Lifnei Tzimtzum, but there's a part of it that's Dveikus, complete connected to its mucker, to what he calls Dveikus Mamash Ba'atzmus Ein Sof. And now he qualifies. We said Dveikus, we said before on the Kav. Remember, we said the Kav, though it's a narrow flow, it's attached, Negeya V'dovuk, it touches and is attached to its source. So he's saying, but that is a Dveikus that came after the Tzimtzum. So he says like this, I'll just read it again. V'loirak Dveikus Sha'idei Tzimtzum. Not just a dveikus that comes after that's idea tzimtzum, which is affected and impacted by the tzimtzum. K'moya kav b'chlal, like the general kav. What do we learn? Shenegeyev v'dovuk be'erein sof. It touches and is attached to erein sof, to the eagle hagadol. Remember, to the eir pre tzimtzum. Avlu idea tzimtzum. But the kav is definitely a force that comes through the tzimtzum. Mashenkin ba'er ha'atzmi. Mashenkin here, the era atzmi of era mamala is even deeper than that, because it's basically he's talking about era mamala as God intends. Basically, there should be a era mamala klama, so it has a era atzmi in it. That's in Dveikus.
What does it mean really?
That's literally attached. As will be explained. So clearly, he's not explaining it in detail now, but he's essentially saying there's a higher level in Eira Mamala than the Kav, and that is the best way to explain it is just like God has the track called Eir HaSeviv and higher levels of Eir. He also has Eira Mamala, and Eira Mamala in its first level is the etzem of Eira Mamala is literally connected to Atzmus Ein Sof, and higher than the Kav, which is only connected, but affected and post Tzimtzum. Now,
But
does
it's
he mean,
also Negeya
does he mean,
V'Davuk. We
does
really
he
don't
mean
understand.
that does he
Yes,
mean that
right?
Mamala Kalaman exists before the Tzimtzum or not? I cannot say. Earlier, he said clearly there's no Mamala before the Tzimtzum. He made it very clear on page 1148. Let me finish explaining, then you could ask anything you want. He said, anyway, not exactly. Actually, you could say there's a Eira Mamala before the Tzimtzum, except it's not revealed yet because it's submerged in the whole bligvul of divine consciousness, pre-Tzimtzum divine consciousness. So it appears that he may be referring to that. In other words, basically the core element that God is emanating a light that will be defined and shape existence. And it's not yet impacted by the Tzimtzum. So there's a level in Eira Mamala he's calling Eira Atzmi of Mamala, just like there's an Eira Atzmi in Bligvul, Etzem and Ispashas. Before the Tzimtzum, he's saying now the same thing. That Eira Pnimi has two levels, and he just explained this higher level. This is higher than the Kav itself. It's like the root of the Kav. But he didn't explain. He says, Kamoishi is Bayer. So there's more to be said about this. You want to say or ask something?
So we have here two things. Number one, he said Kemoishi is boil.
Are you going to ask something or are you going to explain something?
Yeah, I want to ask.
Okay.
He
Go
said
ahead.
Kemoishi is boil. That means right now we still don't understand that. This is a question. Al Yedei Tzimtzum is Negeya V'Davuk. We don't understand what is the difference. I am asking, right?
What are you asking?
The question is, he said that these vehicles is mamish b'Ensof, not kemoi hakav shehu al yedei hatzimtzum.
I just explained.
But the kav is also negeya v'davuk.
But I just explained. Did you hear what I just said?
Yes. That's my question.
What do you mean? You're asking me what I said, or you didn't hear what I said?
I heard what you said, but I have a question. It's not clear to me.
But after you had the question, did you hear what I said already in explaining it or not?
Yes.
Okay.
I heard everything. But could you explain it? How?
Very simple. I already explained that even Lifnei Tzimtzum, there's a Eira Mamala and there's Eira Seviv, the way Eibishter wants it. The Kav is an operational force that comes after the Tzimtzum. We already discussed the Kav. But the Kav has a root. Who is telling the Kav to be a Eir HaMamala? The root of the Kav is Eir HaMamala that's higher than the Kav and even pre-Tzimtzum Bapashtas here. In other words, there's a Eir HaSeviv Lifnei Tzimtzum and there's Eir HaMamala Lifnei Tzimtzum. They don't have yet substance. There's no substance to them, but there's definitely, they don't come from nowhere. Essentially, it's God basically wants them both to be. So clearly he's going to explain it more, Kamoshi is Bayer, but at this point, he's saying, one second. At this point, it's clear that we're talking about something that's not Al Yedei HaTzimtzum. It's basically the root of Eira Mamala, that he says these words, Klolos Eira Mamala. The Kav, remember, is the first manifestation of Mamala as we know it. But I pointed out a few times and brought from Sadik Dalet, he even said, that is the Eira Kav B'chlal and Eira Mamala B'frat. Eira Mamala is a track of divine energy that is pre the Kav. So you have to keep that in mind. And since it's pre the Kav, it is now, he's talking on a deeper level that in Eir Pnimi, you have two levels. First, he explained B'pshita that seemingly, ostensibly, it's the Kav. Now he's saying it's higher than the Kav. It's Eir Mamala, just as Eir HaSeviv or Eir HaBligvul of Lifnei Tzimtzum has two levels, Eir Mamala. So I was explaining, this is God's desire to have an Eir Mamala. Is it the Eses Sfiris Hagnuzis? Is it Shir Asrei Bekeach? I'm not sure. At this point, it didn't say exactly. But all of that can be explained as the root of Eira Mamala, because it's already, it's God envisioning the structure of existence. It's still completely submerged, Lifnei Tzimtzum, in one big soup of a field of energy of Bli Gvul, like I said, the divine consciousness. And after the Tzimtzum will become operative, but the Kav is getting instruction from a mamaladic energy that says enter bepnimis, or else it would still be makif. So he's saying this Eira Mamala has a level of etzem, which is etzem ha'eir, as he calls it. That's bedvekus mamish k'nis atzmus ein sof. The Eira atzmi of Eira Mamala.
And the kav, before he said that the kav lemailo is kosher with the etzem. Etzem haseviv or etzem hamamali?
Okay, let me finish discussing this. It's a little distracting. Let me finish learning it. Then any questions you have, bring up afterwards. Okay? So, for who er atzmi, and this is an er atzmi, we're talking now er mamala. It's a er atzmi, meaning all its focus is, as I explained before, its entire focus is the divine expression of mamala, not the objective, but the divine expression. So it's a er atzmi shein b'chinas hamshacha v'gili be'etzem. Just like we said about the er hablikvul before the tzimtzum, this too is not yet in a state, or it's not a state of transmission or function or expression, v'gili be'etzem. Be'etzem, it's not in that way of Amshacha v'gili. Even Mamala, it's basically, as I said, it's the divine interest in having Mamala, and therefore Mamala senses the Atzmi Shebezeh. It's not about its Amshacha and Gili, it's about the Kavana Ha'atzmus within it, is the way I would explain these words. Uba'ir Hazeh, even though it's an Er Pnimi, Lo Yesh Chilukim Madregas, there's no distinction of levels, even in Mamala. The Ein Shayich boy shemismayit memadrega lemadrega, because he's comparing it to Etzem Ha'er, and you can't say that it's possible that it should be diminished from level to level. I'll explain this in a moment a bit more. That's the first level in Mamala, and B'chinas is Pashtus Ha'er in Mamala. And now the extension or the expression of this is in a state of transmission and revelation and revealed. The klola sa'ed hazeu b'chinas shaychus ala elamis. And this general energy, the general state, is having now a relationship, has some relationship with existence, with the worlds. I'm going to read till the end of the paragraph, then I'm going to explain this. So just bear with me. You know what? Maybe let me explain something before we continue. Just be a little easier. Bear in mind that from the point of view of Atzmus, everything is possible. The only reason we have a structured system of Etzem Ha'er and Spashtus Ha'er and Er HaBlikvul and Er HaGvul, and then the Tzimtzum and then Kav and all the levels in between and over and under, is in order because God wanted it to be done in a logical progression, and that we should have a road back to trace the steps to connect, as we've discussed many, many times. So let's talk about this a moment. Is it possible, from God's point of view, if he wanted to create the world, he could have just emanated a Oir HaMamala without a Oir HaBlikvul altogether? Right? He wants existence, so he could have created right away an energy that defines the piece of art that he wants. And there's no discussion about infinite types of art or a state of the artist pre-art. In the language Lamaila, that there's first a state of energy that's not even expressed, it's just a reflection of Atzmus. And then there's levels where it begins to consider existence only in a heskim. And then there's a shakavitaria, a deliberation, and then there's a breaking it into details and a determination. And then there's another level. He could have just said, Nisava Kodesh Baruch Hu liyis le'dira b'tachtenim, and the next step is Mamala Kalam. Okay, Mamala Kalam goes through stages, until there's a tzimtzum, and then there's a kav, and the rest of Ishtalshlus is formed and shaped. But the thing is, the Eibishter wanted us to have a relationship also with Bligvul. And he wanted the Bligvul to be internalized in our lives. Second point is that Bligvul and the Etzem Ha'oyer is much more reflective of Atzmus. If Atzmus jumped to Mamala Kalalman, even though Mamala is completely God's will to emanate in a limited flow, but then there'd be no jump from Mamala Kalalman to Atzmus would be too big of a leap for us to relate to. So the Eibishter made it in this way. There's Etzem Ha'oyer, that's only reflective of Atzmus, as we discussed. Then there's Haspashtus Ha'oyer, all in the Eir HaBligvul. The Eir is now beginning to have a function. And there begins all these levels we learned about Ratzon, the Ratzon HaKloli, and the Ratzon HaPrati, and the Ratzon HaKodum, the three levels. And in the Ratzon HaKloli, Heskim, Shakavitaria, and Hachlota, etc., etc. Then you have in the last stage, the Ratzon HaKodum, or even Ratzon HaPrati, God is beginning to envision the details of existence and allocates resources. So now we have a much more logical progression. And we know that when he's allocating resources or envisioning the 10 spheres, all Lifnei Tzimtzum, that is all a piece of, it's the infinite possibilities, envisioning one possibility. So we have a much more logical bridge and interface between Gvul and Bligvul. Because by God, the Gvul is just an expression of his Bligvul. Could he have jumped the Bligvul and gone straight to Gvul? Of course he could have. So now, what the Rebbe Rashab is saying here, and this is, I'm explaining it, that in truth, Mamala Kalalman doesn't begin with the Kav after the Tzimtzum. It begins in God's intentions that he wants to have an energy that's going to enter. Just like he wants an energy that is infinite possibilities, going back to the artist, he wants an energy that the infinite possibilities become one possibility, and that's called the 10 spheres. All envisioned Lifnei Tzimtzum. So if you think about it, the Sheirish HaMamala is basically also Atzmus Ein Sof. Also Atzmus wants Mamala. It's only that in Atzmus, Mamala and Seviv are like equal. There aren't two kavim. There's no two. It's all part of one thing, because you can't call God Atzmus Bli Gvul, and you can't call him Gvul. He's beyond Bli Gvul and Gvul. But then, first in the Eir Atzmi, first manifests the Eir Bli Gvul. Within the Eir Bli Gvul manifests the Eir Gvul. But the Eir Gvul is also connected, is also part of the divine plan. So if you think about in that language, he's saying, so just like there's Etzem Eir Ispashtus Eir in Bli Gvul, in the Eir Lifnei Tzimtzum, there's also Etzem Eir Ispashtus Eir in Gvul, in Eir Gvul, because it's also connected to the Etzem. And as I explained before, what is that meaning? What is the meaning of it? The meaning of it is that Mamala Kalam has a dimension in it that all that matters to it is that God wants me to be Mamala Kalam. In that sense, it's equal to Sevav Kalam, because Sevav Kalam also has a level of Etzem. It doesn't care whether it's Bli Gvul or Gvul. What difference does it make? God wants me to be Bli Gvul, so I'm Bli Gvul. God wants me to be Eira Gvul, I'm Eira Gvul, ultimately. So basically, from the divine will, if you wish, or from the divine dimension, they both have, Mamala and Seva, both of them have a connection, and they're attached to Atzmus Ein Sof Mamish. It's just two different, they will ultimately be different tracks, and Mamala will emerge from Seviv, or the Eira Gvul will emerge from the Eira Bli Gvul, but it still retains an element that connects it straight to the source. Or using the example I've given, the king has a chief of staff, but then he takes another appointed official and says, your job is to go travel to the edge of the kingdom and speak to the people there. From the point of view of the king's command, the chief of staff is just, the guy being sent off who knows where, is just as connected to the king than the chief of staff is. We're not talking about delegated by the chief of staff. It could go through the chief of staff. He may be the one that gives the instruction, but the instruction is coming from the king, not from the chief of staff. So from the point of view of the Ratzon HaMelech, from the king's desire, What difference does it make whether he's giving infinite instructions or he's giving one instruction? Or the instruction is to someone who remains close to him and reflects all his instructions, or whether that one of the instructions is someone to go off who knows where. It's all part that one is also connected in the root to Dovuk to Atzmus Ein Sof. So Mamala has its own connection. It may travel through Seviv, through Bligvul, I should say, but it still has the Iragvul is there because the Eibishter wants it to be there. God wants it to be there. So that's a dimension in Mamala, just like the Eira Bligvul, if not Tzimtzum, that's called Etzem HaEira Mamala. And that is beyond extension because it's not relevant here that Mamala is there to shape existence and to be an immanent energy. Right now is relevant only that God wants it and that it's a godly energy. From the divine energy point of view, Mamala is as divine as Seviv is. Eira HaGvul is just as divine as Eira Bligvul. That's how I would explain this. And then Mamala has another side, just like Eira Bligvul has another side. Eira Bligvul has the Hispashtus Se'er, its functionality, its expression, where in that case will become the place where it starts going levels before the Tzimtzum. And Eira Mamala also has a functionality and expression and extension. And that is that it becomes something that is going to shape existence. So basically he's explaining that conceptually, Eira Mamala has two levels in it, just like Eira Bligvul does. So does Eira Mamala does. That's what he's saying right now. So this is deeper and higher than the explanation in the Kav. The Kav is after the Tzimtzum. And the Kav is definitely the operative tool and instrument that implements Mamala Kalam. And there's the two levels of the Kav. It's attached to the Eira and Sof Lifnei Tzimtzum, and the Kav as it descends and creates different levels. Here we're talking about a level before the Kav, basically the root of the Kav. It doesn't say that explicitly, but that's what it sounds like. The Mamala as God is choosing it to be a Mamala. So that's how I would explain what he's saying right now. It'd be interesting if the Rebbe Rash Frierdiker Rebbe, let me just see quickly whether he elaborates on this topic. We will get to it, but right now, let me see. I want to see if the Frierdiker Rebbe says anything. 1 second. Yeah, we're going to learn a lot about it, actually, more. And I hope I was machaven. If not, I'll correct myself. Yeah, he speaks about it, but much later, already in the next mimer, page 107, 108. But we'll get there when we need to get there. Right now, this is what the Rebbe Rashab is saying. And now he's going to explain with this some more stuff about Ak. But before I continue here, does anybody want to ask anything or any question?
Rabbi Jacobson,
I'm a little... Okay. Go ahead.
Reshimu would be the Memale, but before or after the Tzimtzum?
The Shimu is not relevant here at all. The Shim is the Sheresh HaKelim. It's not Oir. The Shimu is the root of the containers. And not, we're talking, everything here is about Oir, Haseviv, Mamala, Etzem, Hispashtus Se'er. What you're referring to is that after the Tzimtzum, a trace of the Shima remains. It's a whole other discussion what the Rishima is. But in short, the Rishima is the root of the containers. It's the Koyach HaGvul, not the Eir HaGvul. So.
Is the Giloy HaKav Megala the Oir Pnimi or the Oir HaSovev or both?
We learned that the Eitz Chaim says Hakav Nimshach Umisagol. So all the Igulim come from the Kav. But the Kav itself is an Er Pnimi. The Kav is a defined line that creates Milo Mata, creates structure. So the Kav is informed by Er HaBligvul and Er Lifnei Tzimtzum, but essentially it's Er HaMamala. But that Er HaMamala will also shape the Makifim, as we learned. So the Kav is generally an Er HaMamala. There's two opinions, which we learned in the beginning of Ayin Beis, where he talks about the beginning of Ayin Beis, he talked about whether the kav is yesh ma'ayin or gilia helam, that the kav is generally, is it rooted in esespheres sagnuzis, which means in the era mamala lifnei tzimtzum, or is it rooted in the era seviv? And the answer is ultimately kav has both dimensions. But generally speaking, the kav, he said clearly, is a er pnimi. He said that right in the beginning, a kav. Kav is a er mamala, era pnimi. That's why it's a kav. But does it carry also era seviv? Yeah, it carries, and it also shapes the igulim that will come afterwards. But generally, kav, we say igulim v'yesher. Igulim is makifim, and yesher is the kav. So it's two different states. But there's iskalus, there's overlap, etc. Okay. So now the Rebbe Rashab continues and says, so now that we know that a mamala, that mamala, there's also etzamer ispashtus. So now he continues the parentheses. Ulechein gam ba'ak yesh b'chinas kelim. And that's why in Ak there's also Kalim. I know you'll jump and say, didn't he just say before there's no Kalim? So 1 second, let's finish the sentence before we jump. Rak, shein b'chinas sherish neshamis de ba'ak. Oh, so, b'chinas ba'ak yesh b'chinas kelim, rak shein b'chinas sherish neshamis. The ba'ak came a kol mokim b'chinas Kalim. Okay. So remember when I discussed this at length yesterday, and it explained what means shadish neshamas de gufis, I gave the example of preconception. That even though preconception, there's no keli yet, there's not even a cell, the father and mother did not yet provide the gashmi, even of a cell, a fertilized egg, that the neshama can manifest in. But yet, the Eibishter is already preparing the neshama to go into that cell, into that fertilized egg, to put it in Gashmizdik terms. So you can't call it a keli on one end, like let's say a kudim. On the other hand, you can't say it's completely beyond. So we call it shadish neshamas de gufus. So now the Rebbe Rashab is going to the other end of Ak. So what causes an Ak? There should be even this level. We can't call it a Kalim Mamish, but he says it's a level of Kalim. It's Shadish Neshamas. But there's something there. So he's saying that's caused by the fact that Mamala Kalalman has a second dimension called Shaychus Elamas. So even though we can't yet call it a Kalim Mamish, but because Mamala Kalalman has a second dimension that relates, that's why an Ak is beginning the relationship to the beginnings of the relationship to existence. So basically, you have to say there's two sides to Ak, depending what you're speaking about. The challenge I have here is a different one. Why is this being said after Mamala? This could have been said after the first piece about the Kav. He said earlier that the Kav, because it radiates the way it is in its source, the way it's connected to attached to the source, it radiates in Ak. That's why in Ak there's no Metzias Dover yet. That even though it sees all of existence, but it's all in one snapshot without any real Ischalkus. So why is he now using the explanation of Ispashtu Se'er of Mamala Kalam, not the Kav, higher than the Kav, and here he's coming to say that there's another side to Ak, where you're already beginning some form of Kalim, even though it's still Shadish and Neshamas, but it's still something of Kalim. That I'm not clear about, why he's saying it here. Why didn't he say it before? He could have said, there's two elements to Ak. On one hand, you can't call it Kalim Mamish because it's attached, because it's radiating the Kav in its intensity beyond existence, essentially. On the other hand, because the Kav is Nimshach, so therefore Ak also has an element of some type of relationship. He's explaining this parenthesis after this deeper explanation of mamala. That's what I'm not clear about. Maybe this will become clarified when we learn Tzadik Daled. I'm going to peek for a second. I have to peek. I'm too curious not to look. Yeah, well, there's a lot. There's a lot on this topic, so I would probably wait to see what the Frierdiker Rebbe says before coming up with my own theories on this topic. But anyway, I just wanted to point it out because it seems to jump out. Suddenly he's bringing Ach again, but I hope everybody's following. So basically, we've now moved at a Mamala Kalam, and there's a deeper way of understanding the two levels of Ayin. We're talking about Mamala itself, the Etzem of Mamala and the Hispashtus of Mamala. And this is not the Kav. It's deeper than the Kav and higher than the Kav. So we have to still also understand what's the difference between this level of Mamala and the Kav. Well, the Kav is after the Tzimtzum. That's the key thing. That's already a functional paintbrush, so to speak. So it has two dimensions to it. The way it's attached to the artist and the way it's creating the art. Here he's talking pre-Tzimtzum, or at least higher than the Kav, where he's talking about in God's so-called plan, you have the Etzem of Eir Mamala and the Hispashtus of Eir Mamala in conceptual terms. Not like the Kav, which isn't conceptual, which is actual. That's how you have to say he's explaining it. But as I said, the Frierdiker Rebbe has plenty of elaboration, so I'm sure all this will be clear. Am I making sense? Does everybody know what I'm trying to say here, or I lost you?
Makes a lot of sense.
Okay, because it's very subtle. I mean, it clearly, the Rebbe Rashab does not want to speak about Mamala only after the Tzimtzum. He wants to speak about Mamala almost like comparable as he speaks about the Lifnei Tzimtzum Er HaBligvul. That's very clear. That's what he wants to say, which of course makes the interface even more intricate and more detailed. I still have to think it through in terms of like what would be the nafkamina lepoil, so to speak, in Aveda, the two levels. You know, we spoke yesterday about, well, in general, as I said yesterday, I'll just say it again. I think just to make this a little more concrete in a way that we can relate to, it ends up coming down, are we focusing on the God dimension, what God wants, or what it is that God wants? In other words, the objective of God's plan, or is it the God's plan in that objective? In other words, the Kav, like I said with the paintbrush, is the paintbrush focusing on the artist's intention in using the brush? In other words, all it is to express the artist, or is it focused on the creation of the art and the details? Both are necessary. That's clear. The question is only, what are you focusing? Like I said, Asher Kedeshanu b'mitzvaysev etzivanu, or on la'niach tefillin, or lahadlik shnei Shabbos Kedesh, or which is the focus? Both are necessary because God wants existence, but where's the focus? That's the key thing I think to keep in mind, helps make this a little easier to understand what are these two dimensions he keeps talking about. But the key thing also is that there's two dimensions in Bligvul and two dimensions in Gvul now, in Eira Gvul, and all that, and the in-between interpretation. Let's not forget that the first ayin is Lifnei Tzimtzum or Seviv, and the second ayin is Mamala. Now we're talking in Mamala itself. You see how intricate this is. But I think we're making some progress here. But again, I think that we're going to learn, first of all, Kamoisha is boyer, so there's more coming. Secondly, the Tzadik Dalet is definitely going to help. The Frierdiker Rebbe's Maimer in explaining a lot of this. Because I see it's pages there. It's not a few lines. It's pages upon pages explaining this. Okay. But it's fascinating to see how the Rebbe Rashab writes it in a few lines, and Frierdiker Rebbe develops it. Yeah. Now he continues. Ukamoisha nimshach. It's okay. So we established now there's two levels of Mamala, Etzem and Hispashtus. The Hispashtus has a connection the Ispashtus has a connection to existence. And that's why Ak has some form of Kalim. As I said, we need more explanation, but that's what he said. Ukamoisha nimshach. Ukamoisha nimshach. And now, as this Eir extends, remember the second level of Eir, Mamala Kalaman, as it's starting to manifest, Hu b'chinas is chalkus. There it's in a state of distinction and levels. To the point that it becomes commensurate and proportionate to be called and considered a source for the Yesh HaNivra. So let's just get the right flow here. Etzem ha'er of mamala. Essentially he said, Lo yesh chiluki madregas. There's no distinction there because all it is a focus of God wanting mamala. That's all it is. Doesn't make a difference whether it's chokhmah or bina or das. God wants a defined energy that's going to create definition. From this point of view, it's only God's desire for definition. It's essentially the source code of mamala is that etzem, and there's no distinction, and there's no and there's not shaykh miut. It's not subject to levels because it's a divine force within mamala. Now we're talking about mamala and its functionality that is beginning to flow, and it's extending and expressing what it's meant to do. Here he says, as it's nimshach, it comes in a state of distinct of levels, to the point that you can call it a mokar liyesh. That's why it's called ayin of the yesh hamisave. Ubeis madregas elu, and these two levels by pnimi, in the imminent internal energy, hu inyan pnimi se'er v'chitzeni se'er. So he's introducing a new term now. The inner dimension of the Eir and the external dimension of the Eir. In other words, it's one Eir, but what are we focusing on? The pnimius of the Eir or the chitzenius of the Eir? V'zeu beis b'chinas ayin. And these are the two levels of ayin. The etzem ha'Eir, the etzem of Eir pnimi, hu b'chinas ha'ayin shel hayesh ha'amiti, is the ayin, the Eir, that reflects the yesh ha'amiti's interest in this Eir pnimi, the chitzenius Eir, and the outer dimension, hu b'chinas ha'ayin shel hayesh ha'misave. That's the ayin, the way it expresses itself and becomes the yesh, the root and the source of the created yesh. And I'm going to explain in a moment. Let me just read the parentheses. Uba protius, and when you break it down further, more specifically, gamba b'chinas chitzenius Eir, also in the outer dimension of Eir, b'chinas alyena sheba, he's breaking the chitzenius Eir itself into two levels. The higher level of the chitzenius Eir, the functional light, that's higher than being a source to the creation. Rak b'chinas achrena sheba, the achrena in chitzenius Eir. So in chitzenius itself, it's like there's a pnimius and a chitzenius. Only the last level, the lowest level, or the last and lowest level of chitzenius Eir, hu b'chinas mokar liyesh. That becomes a source for the yesh, and another ukamoishi is bair, as shall be explained. So the good news is there's more to hear from the Rebbe Rashab, and meanwhile we have to try to figure out what we can figure out. So he's now explained two levels of ayin in Eir pnimi, even higher than the kav, and there's basically the inner and outer dimension of Eir, and in the outer there's also two levels. One is beyond the yesh, and one is closer to the yesh. The point you see here is look how many levels he's spelling out to make the interface as easy as possible. In other words, the more stepping stones there are, the easier it is for us to climb. So we don't have to jump. So it's basically stepping stones from the finite to the infinite and beyond. And that's what we see here now. I mean, you can count now two levels of ayin in Lifnei Tzimtzum, Etzem and Ispashtus, 2 levels of ayin, lifnei tzimtzum and la'achri seviv mamala. Now 2 levels of ayin in mamala, and 2 levels of ayin in the chitzenius ha'er of mamala. There's also 2. So you could, if you really think about it, you could basically find these 2 levels of ayin everywhere. He doesn't say that explicitly, but it's pretty clear because it's all relative to where you are. As I said yesterday, for some people, it all depends on your avodah. For you, the ayin of the yesh amiti could just be that you do a little iskafia today and not so much focused on yourself. For somebody else, that's not ayin of the yesh amiti, that's the ayin of the yesh anivra. That's the bittul to godliness that relates to us. And then the ayin would be higher and higher and higher, as we're learning here. Okay, what I want to say in explaining this a bit is the following.
Could I ask something?
Just a second, let me just give one explanation, then you could ask, okay? Give me one. If you may recall, we learned about Pnimius HaKeli and Chitzenius HaKeli. I think it could help us a little here. Remember, a very simple way, Balabatisha way of understanding it. When you're using, let's say, a Kiddush cup, a becher, a kos, that you use make Kiddush on Shabbos. So we learned there's a Chitzenius of the Keli. That's the part that you put to your mouth. That's the function of the Shema Pa'ula, the function of the kos, which is what? To drink from. To drink, to pour to others. Then there's Pnimius HaKeli. What's Pnimius HaKeli? Is not the part you put to your mouth, it's the inside of the cup that it's conducive to hold wine. It focuses on the mashpia. Remember, it's wine, the cup, and you. So think of that. The wine would be like the yesh, the you, the makabel would be the yesh hanivra, and the ayin be'emtza would be the cup. I know I'm talking about a keli, not oir, but I just want to give the example. So there's a part of the cup that has to be able to hold wine. If you put wine in the wrong type of a cup, it can get spoiled. It can dilute it. It can give it a taste. You need the right type of cup. That all its job is, I'm carrying the wine to the person who's going to drink the wine. And then there's the kos as its functionality. He explained there's also there's also a third level called kelim emtsoyim, but I don't want to go there right now. So wait, what's the difference between which parts of the cup? Basically, it depends what you're talking about. If you're talking about the function of the cup, then if the cup holds wine and you can't drink from it, whatever, there's nowhere to put your mouth, whatever it may be, or it's a sealed cup, you have Pnimius HaKeli, you don't have Chitzenius HaKeli. You need a function. On the other hand, if you only have the function, but you don't have a keli to hold wine, let's say the keli has holes in it, so the wine will spill out, or the keli spoils the wine, that equally is a problem. So bottom line is, for anything to function properly, you need to have it being a keli. And then it can be a mashpia, so to speak, to the makabel. Or take a teacher and a student. The pnimius is the connection of the student to the teacher. And the chitzenius is the teacher impacting the student on the student's level. So every seichel has the bittul of the talmud to the makabel to the mashpia, the talmud to the rav. He's absorbing something higher. So basically he's a clay reikon, he's makabel. But then there's another side, which actually means the student has to be able to understand what's being said. It's not just bittul. Bittul is necessary to be a keli, but then you need to have the actual hashpah. So my point I'm making with the oyer, you could say also the oyer on a more subtle level, obviously. There's the oyer that where it senses the instructions of its creator. And all it is about is the oyer reflecting what Atzmus wants, what Elikus wants. And then there's the oyer has to fulfill its job. So we know, let's say, when it comes to Ashliach, what's more important? To be bottled to the Mishaleach or to do the job of the Shlichus? The answer is both, but it's two states. First, you have to have the bittul to the Mishaleach, and then you do the job, and while you're doing the job, you're also being bottled to the Mishaleach. But it's two stages within that ayin. So ayin is bittul. The question is the bittul to the source, or is the bittul to doing what you have to get done? And that's really the interface we're discussing here. But the difference is, we're not talking about a keli here, we're talking about oir. So there's the oir as its focus is that it's attached to its source. And there's the Eir, its focus is that the source is telling it, go do a job, go create existence, which is still attached to its source. He never says that it loses its attachment. However, the focus is now on getting the job done, the function, as opposed to the bittul to the mokir, even though the bittul is there as well. Remember, it's one ayin that divides into two. It's not two levels of ayin. It's one Eir, nechlak l'shtayim, as he says a number of times. That's how I would explain this a bit more. Go ahead, Rab Shleima.
According to all of this, it's fascinating, but we learn now that the oil, even in the Memale, etzem oil is not shaykh hamshocher.
Right.
Many times Chassidus is being explained, like in the Maimer from the Rebbe, Tzadik, Chosid, V'Yashar, that there is chitzenius, arich, and then there is keser, which is pnimius, and then there is pnimius atik. Is this pnimius, and this pnimius atik we could reach? Is this the etzem ha'oil found symptom, the pnimius atik? Is this the oil she'eino shayach lehamshocher?
First of all, I wouldn't bring atik into here because atik is later. There's no pnimius atik here. I'm not clear what you're asking me. He said like this: there's etzem ha'er is pashtus ha'er before the tzimtzum in the er habligvul. We learned that length. He's now being machadish that there's an etzem ha'er and pashtus ha'er also a mamala. So what are you asking me exactly? Then the etzem is mamala's connection to its source, meaning atzmus is instructing mamala to be mamala. That's essentially what etzem is. So it's not shaykh to chalkus or amshachi yet. It's basically atzmus's instruction to eir mamala, just like atzmus's instruction to eir haseviv or eir habligvul. That's what he's saying here. I mean, I wouldn't try to make a comparison. Pnimius atik is just going to confuse matters because pnimius atik is later. But my point is, there's a state in mamala where you focus on asher kedushanim mitzvayis v'tzivanu as opposed to the particular function that it has. Just like there is these two in Eir HaBligvul, the same thing as in Eir HaGvul or Eir HaMamala. That's what he's saying here.
Hey, thank you. Shkayach.
Sure. It's still, listen, there's a commercial bar, so clearly there's going to be more, but I think it's taking shape. He's essentially explaining something very vital, and that is that even the Eir HaMamala, that ultimately will become a force that defines creation, has in it something that is also atzmizdik, just as Eir HaSeviv. In other words, like we learned, if you remember, we learned about Lamayla Aden Ketz, Lamata Aden Tachlis. He says in Atzmus, Shneim Shavim Hem. You think there's a difference between Seviv and Mamala or Bligvul and Gvul in the highest levels? Of course not. He's beyond both of them. Then when they become two tracks, one is Eir HaBligvul, one is Eir HaGvul, he's saying the Eir HaGvul also has an atzmizdik connection, but we're going to learn that it comes through Seviv, through Bligvul, and the other way around also. The Bligvul later comes through the Gvul. So there is a constant interaction that just makes the interface more richer and more robust, or what's the word I want to use? More integrated. Okay, we'll stop here with the bottom of page 1150 at the end of the paragraph. I just want to see if we're going to go to Tzadik Daled now. Should we go, or do we continue here? Let me just see a second. Not for now, for tomorrow. Wow. It can go either way. I probably would go to Tzadik Daled now. Yeah. Wow. Just a second. We're probably going to go to Tzadik Daled tomorrow, just pointing that out. Okay. So we shall stop here. Let's stop.